Chapter 3.1 Lionheart. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Who is Jihad? Why? He is a relative who lives in the corner of the countryside. Where's this countryside? At the western end of the empire. Why are you even interested? It's a hillside where we'll never go. Cyan and Seal are fraternal twins. Although their father is Seo Chul, it is no secret that the head of the family loves his second wife more than his first wife, who is faithful. Such a reality has made the noses of these two 13-year-old boy and girl high enough to reach the sky. Note, Seo Chul is the son of the second wife of the head. His name is Eugene. He has the same age as us. Hey, age doesn't define a friend. He continued, looking toward the detached house in the distance. I heard it's the first time he had ever been to the capital. According to Gordon, earlier he couldn't even bat his eyes out of the window throughout the time he was in the carriage. That's understandable. I heard he is from Jidal. Does he know that place is so far away that no one even bothers to remember? I think that place is only full of forest and fields. I don't know because I've never been there, but it's probably because it's the country. Did he get motion sickness on the warp gate? Gordon said he looked like he was going to throw up. I guess he didn't vomit then. Oh, that's a shame. If he had thrown up, I was going to order him to clean up his own mess. Seal said with a mischievous smile. At her sister's answer, Cyan clicked his fingers left and right and clicked his tongue. You idiot, you don't have to throw up to clean up. What do you mean? He's coming from a hillside, and his body's gonna smell like cow dung. Aha! He had been on the wagon for a few days, and the smell of cow dung from his body must have been on the wagon. Oh, it's dirty. Seal stuck out her tongue and looked disgusted. However, her eyes were full of mischievous playfulness. The carriage he came from is the property of the family. Even if we are related, he should take responsibility if he defiles the carriage because of himself, right? Yes, that's right. I heard that earlier. As soon as he got to the annex, he went to the ballroom and wielded a wooden sword. That's the worst. Seal chuckled a laugh. The twins born on the same day have been a good match since they were young. It's his first time in the capital, and it's his first time in the main house. That's why he is so nervous. Seal bursts into laughter as he slaps his brother's arm. However, Cyan made a solemn expression. Our stupid relative. He must have high expectations for this blood ceremony. He didn't get a proper education from his father. Yes, yes. Now, he pretends to be training in order to show off in front of the adults. He is such a disgusting guy. You have to scold him directly. Oh, it's a little too much to scold. You shouldn't do that, rather you should be careful. Don't get scolded by adults later. You're too nice. Seal smiled back even though she knew his brothers inside. The young twins learned from the very beginning that it was more interesting to do something stealthy than to do something openly. Let's go. Cyan took the lead with a strong shout. Seal, who was following closely, turned his head back. The two twins, who had been carrying out mana since childhood, could perceive them even with naked eye. In the magnificent and splendid mansion, there was a boy standing by the window on the third floor. He slid back and closed the curtains when Seal had eye contact. At the sight, Seal grinned and stuck out her tongue. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. A child in the family should not be armed with a blade until he or she has proven his bloodline. Eugene did not want to respect the not-so-funny tradition, but his father Jihad could not ignore Lionheart's tradition. This is because there were so many eyes on the mansion to just keep it a secret between father and son. Light. Eugene crumpled his expression and looked down at his wooden sword. From the age of 7 he had wielded an iron sword, and by the age of 12 he had wielded a steel sword and was no longer a training sword. The wooden sword that Eugene wielded for more than a year was a heavy weapon enough to make a bone even if he swung it roughly. But it's not a weapon that established a blade. Even if he increases the amount of iron to increase the weight and grow it out of your muscles. It was just a wooden sword for now. Eugene has been doing it every day since he was able to control his body completely. He was not lazy even for a single day. He has to live hard because he has reincarnated. It was not because of the idea that he reincarnated why he worked hard. Eugene has originally this kind of personality. When he traveled with Vermouth, he had never neglected to practice unless there was a battle. But that bastard made me see that even with efforts still can't surpass him. Vermouth, you tasteless bastard. Eugene grated his teeth, recalling his previous memories. In his previous life, his body was overworked till it was at breaking point. Even so, the performance of an overworked body is more than imaginable. Vermouth. I don't know if this body, which was born as a descendant of yours, is superior. However, it was clear that it was far superior to the full Hamel body. Even if he still hasn't start training mana, his 13-year-old body that hasn't even grown up can swing that heavy piece of iron. Do you have a heavier wooden sword? It should be a little big. I think I've swung it hundreds of times already, but I barely sweat. Eugene crumpled his face and looked back. And I told you to stay in the shade over there. Why are you standing under the sun? Well, I'm fine. It's okay. You sweat like that. Don't be stubborn and sit in the shade. No, it's not that. Do you have any other wooden swords? Nina looked perplexed as she was sweating profusely. His opponent is a 13-year-old boy from the countryside. Even the younger generation of his family can't be ignored. A temporary term is attached as an exclusive servant, but it is impossible for the owner to now rest in the shade while performing. The wooden sword is all that's in the storage room of the mist. The other wooden sword will be in the main house's armament. Can't you go get it? I can't decide for myself. I'll go ask you if you want to, but... Okay, then. Eugene shook his head without regret. As he heard earlier, Nina was only 16 years old. He heard it's just time for an apprenticeship ticket, but he didn't want to make an unreasonable demand and embarrass her. He's very outspoken. Eugene put down his wooden sword, swallowing the ridicule he is feeling inside. Why did they give him a girl who was just out of her apprenticeship? Isn't it obvious? When a clumsy servant makes a mistake or disrespect, he is persecuted, they will find a fault within him. I don't know what kind of baby you're coming from, but you're so low. Even if you swing your neck more, you won't be able to warm up. Eugene scrambled for the warehouse. Then Nina hurriedly chased after Eugene. Eugene, if you need anything, please let me know. I don't want anything else, but I can choose what to use for training. What if you don't like what I ordered you? Why bother you 2 or 3 times? The warehouse, which is not normally used, was full of dust. Nina sweated a cold sweat in the dust. In fact, I have been trying to clean it for a few days, but it has remained this way because the mayor, who is in charge of the detached house, denied me that I don't have it. Sorry. I'm sorry. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What? Eugene was not bothered by Nina with her head down from behind his back. He rummaged through the dust and found what he needed. A sandbag tied to one's body. He found something quite useful on the shelf. He doesn't even grease it properly and he is wearing dusty chain armor. It was much bigger than Eugene's physique, but he liked the heavy weight of the vest. After that, Eugene even took out a spear bigger than him. All I can do for you is step on this. After leaving the warehouse, Eugene said, pointing to a spear on the floor. Nina stepped on the spear as she was told. Fix it so that it doesn't move like that. Eugene began to hang the sandbag from the spear. Nina saw it all with her eyes that she was sick of it. Now Eugene is wearing a chain vest bigger than his physique, and is hanging sandbags from both arms. There were some sandbags hanging from the spear. That's ridiculous. The weight of the armors alone seemed to be a double of his weight. However, Eugene shook his hand with a satisfied expression. Now get out of the way. Yes, yes. Eugene held the spear with both hands, bending only his knees. He gritted his teeth for a moment under the dizzying weight, but he enjoyed the feeling of muscles pulling until his bones was shaking. Back. No, farther. Go to the shade over there. Yes. Yes. Nina was surprised and stepped back. Eugene swung the spear loudly only after confirming Nina's withdrawal. Waha wah wah. However, the weight added to the body does not attract people. This purpose of wearing a vest and hanging a sandbag separately. Eugene swung the spear fiercely, continuing with his heavy steps. Whenever that happens, both arms are pulled as if they will fall out, and the waist that adds rotation screams. Nina shut her mouth at the sight. It seemed that a catastrophe would happen that could not be handled by that young body. Eugene, who was likely to collapse, did not. Rather, whenever his body falters, the movement of the spear becomes faster. Force the movement with added rotation. And immediately switch to stabbing. It feels like the calluses on both palms are being ripped off. The pain. He didn't wear gloves so he could feel the pain. Eugene giggled and continued to swing the spear. Holding the blood-soaked hand sliding on the window with only the grip force. His eyes are red with red blood because he is so strong, and his breathing is tight. Hey! Nina watched the scene with so much attention that she was startled by the voice she heard next to her. What is he doing? Cyan and Seal, the malevolent twins who made punching bags out of numerous apprenticeships till they soaked themselves tears. The two came right next to each other and were flashing their eyes. Young master, young lady. What brings you here? What is he doing? Cyan squinted his eyebrows. He didn't like it when people who he didn't even know their names didn't answer questions right away. If it were normal, he would have scolded him so that he wouldn't do it again. But now, he was more concerned about what that countryman was doing than that. You don't even know? It wasn't Nina who answered. Eugene took a deep breath and lowered the window. Do you know what this is? Eugene asked, kicking the lowered window. What's he doing? Cyan frowned instead of answering straight away, and Seal standing beside him grinned. It's a spear, you idiot. You don't even know that? That's a spear. But what? You know this is a spear, but you don't know what it is needed to swing a spear? I know. But why are you asking me what I'm doing? I didn't ask. My brother asked. Then let your stupid brother know that I am wielding a spear. Seal's eyes were open in a circle at the noise. On the contrary, Cyan's eyes became thinner. You think I'm stupid? Me? I don't think you're smart because you've seen it openly and you don't know. Appa, that country boy is calling you stupid. Seal giggled and poked Cyan in the ribs. She instinctively knew that this way, rather than being as angry as her brother, encouraging his anger made the situation more interesting. How dare you? Cyan shouted as soon as he heard what her sister just said. Chapter 4. Who was Gerhard again? He's that guy, the one who lives in a corner of the Jidal province. And where exactly is the Jidal province? It's at the westernmost part of the empire. What's the point? It isn't like we'll ever need to go to such a rural area. Two children giggled mockingly as they gossiped about the new arrival. These two were Cyan and Seal, fraternal twins born to the second wife of the main house. Though their mother was the second wife, it was no secret that the patriarch favored her over the official first wife. Such circumstances made these two 13-year-old children prideful enough to hold their noses so high in the air that they pointed straight at the sky. That bastard's name is... Cyan trailed off. I heard it's Eugene and that he's the same age as us, Seal said. So what? It's not like we're going to be friends just because our ages are similar, Cyan declared arrogantly while giggling. Looking at the annex in the distance, he continued speaking, I heard that this is his first time in the capital. Gordon told me earlier that he couldn't take his eyes off the window the whole time he was in the carriage. Well, it's understandable. He comes from a nowhere location like the Jidal province, after all. Does that place have anything to see other than forests and fields? Cyan asked his sister. How should I know? I've never been there before either, but that's probably the case since it's out in the country. Did you hear if he got motion sickness from the warp gate? Seal asked in return. I heard that he had a nauseous expression on his face. So it looks like he didn't end up vomiting. How disappointing. If he had ended up vomiting, I was thinking of making him clean the carriage, Seal said with a mischievous smile. At this prankish reply from his sister, who was younger than him by a few seconds, Cyan clicked his tongue and shook his finger at her. Idiot. If you want to order him to clean the carriage, he doesn't need to have thrown up. What are you saying? Seal asked. Since that brat came here from the countryside, then his body must reek of cow dung. In my opinion, he's probably lifted more pitchforks in his entire life than wooden swords, said Cyan scornfully. Aha! Seal exclaimed in enlightenment. Since he rode in the carriage for a few days, the smell of cow dung clinging to his body must have rubbed off onto the carriage as well, Cyan elaborated. Ugh! How nasty, Seal said, her face twisting into a disgusted expression as she stuck out her tongue. However, her disgust was isolated to her expression, as her eyes were instead filled with mischievous playfulness. The carriage he rode in is our family's property. No matter what our relationship, if the carriage was dirted because of him, then he should be held accountable, right? Cyan asked. Yep, that's right, Seal agreed. I just so happened to hear that as soon as that brat arrived at the annex, he went straight to the gym and started swinging a wooden sword, Cyan said. What a show-off, Seal burst into laughter. The twins, who had been born on the same day, had always gotten along well. Well, it is his first time in the capital, and he's also arrived at the main estate. That's probably why he's putting on such a pretense, Cyan sneered. Putting on a pretense? Just say it like it is, brother. He's trying to show off. Seal kept on laughing as she slapped her brother's arm in amusement. However, in contrast, Cyan put on a stern look and straightened his back. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Speaking of this stupid relative of ours, it seems that he must have come to the bloodline continuation ceremony with high expectations of himself. It looks like he wasn't properly educated by his father. Yep, Seal agreed with her brother. First, he ruins the carriage by getting his smell everywhere, and now he's trying to show off to the adults by pretending to be training. How cheeky of him, Cyan said. Looks like he needs to be punished, said Seal. Hey, now, punishment is going a bit too far. Why don't we just remind him about things he should and shouldn't do? It's for his own good. After all, we wouldn't want him to get scolded by the grown-ups later. You're too nice, brother. Seal gave her full agreement with a grin despite knowing her brother's true intentions. These young twins had long since learned that sneaky pranks like this were much more fun than outright bullying. Let's go. Cyan led the way with a forceful cry. Seal skipped along behind him before turning her head as she felt a gaze observing her from afar. The twins had been practicing mana since their childhood and could sense even intangible things like gazes. Within the majestic and splendid mansion, a young man stood in a window on the 3rd floor. After exchanging looks with Seal, he leaned back and pulled the curtains shut. Seal smiled bashfully at this sight and stuck out her tongue. Until the bloodline continuation ceremony, children of collateral lines weren't allowed to wield sharpened weapons. While Eugene had absolutely no respect for such a ridiculous tradition, his father Gerhard would never dare to ignore a Lionheart family tradition. There were too many eyes in their mansion to keep it a secret from the main family. It's too light. Eugene's brow furrowed as he looked down at the wooden sword. He had wielded a wooden sword with an iron core ever since he was 7, and at the age of 12, he had begun practicing his swings with an iron bar that barely resembled a wooden sword. It might be covered with a thin layer of wood, but the wooden sword that Eugene had been wielding for over a year now was heavy enough to crush bones with a casual swing. However, it wasn't a sharpened weapon, so that was all right. Even if a greater amount of iron had been added to increase the weight, and it had grown to a size that few could even lift, it was still just a wooden sword. To perfectly control his body, Eugene had been training every single day, not wasting even a day lying around. Since he'd gotten a second chance through reincarnation, he had to make the most of his new life. But funnily, it wasn't his reason for working this hard. Eugene had been like this from the very beginning. Even when he'd been traveling with Vermouth and his other companions, he never missed a chance to train unless it was unavoidable. Despite that fucker still had the nerve to say that I wasn't working hard enough. Vermouth, that disgusting bastard, Eugene ground his teeth as he recalled that guy's dreary gaze. Eugene had come to realize that he was pushing his body far harder than he had in his previous life. Each time he pushed himself physically, it felt like his body was breaking through its previously imagined limits. He still couldn't be sure whether the body he had been born with as Vermouth's descendant was superior to Vermouth's own. However, it was clear that this body was far superior to that of stupid Hamill's. He hadn't even begun to dabble with mana. So, as a 13-year-old with a body that still wasn't fully grown, did it really make sense that he was able to wield such a heavy piece of iron? Don't you have any wooden swords that are heavier than this? It would be good if they were a bit bigger as well, Eugene asked. It felt like he had already swung it hundreds of times, but he was barely sweating. Eugene frowned and turned his head towards Nina. Also, I told you to stay in the shade over there. Why are you standing out here in the sunlight? I am fine, Nina replied. As if you can be fine when you're sweating like that. Stop being so stubborn and go sit in the shade. No, hold on. Before that, do you have any other wooden swords? Even as Nina was sweating profusely, she had a perplexed look on her face. The person in front of her was a 13-year-old child from a collateral line. Still, as a junior servant of the main family, he wasn't someone that she could disregard. Although it might only be temporary, she had been assigned as his personal attendant, so it was impossible for her to rest in the shade while her master was training. The wooden swords the gymnasium's storeroom should have all the ones available. Any other wooden swords would probably be in the main gymnasium. Can you get some here? I'm afraid that I can't be the judge of that. If you wish, I could go and ask, but if that's the case, then it's fine. You don't need to go. Eugene shook his head without any reluctance. He had heard from her earlier that Nina was only 16. She had only just gotten her apprenticeship qualifications, so he didn't want to make things difficult for her by making unreasonable demands. This is just too blatant. Eugene suppressed a grin as he put down the wooden sword. Why did they assign him a maid who was fresh out of her apprenticeship? Wasn't it obvious? If he were to take his frustrations out on her when the clumsy attendant made a mistake or caused disrespect, he'd be setting himself up to be punished instead. I don't know whose idea this was, but they sure are underhanded. If he were to keep swinging this wooden sword, he wouldn't even be able to warm up. Casually swinging his arms, Eugene headed over to the storeroom. This caused Nina to immediately try and catch up to him. Master Eugene, if there's anything you need, please instruct me instead. If it were anything else, then maybe, but if I'm going to use it to train, then I need to pick it myself. What would be the point if I told you to fetch something, but it didn't suit me? Should I just waste both our time by sending you over repeatedly until you get something I can use? Instead, if I fetch it myself, then it'll be over in a snap. The warehouse showed that it hadn't seen regular use in a while because everything was covered in dust. Nina felt a cold sweat break out on her back as she saw the dust billowing in the wind. In fact, she had wanted to clean up this place for a few days now, but the maid in charge of the annex had rebuked her, saying it wasn't necessary, so it had been left like this. My apologies," Nina said. "What for?" Eugene didn't pay any attention to Nina bowing her head in apology behind him. He wandered through the dust until he found what he had been looking for, sandbags that could be worn on the body. He also found something useful on a shelf. It was a chainmail vest that hadn't been properly greased and left covered in dust. Although it was much bigger than Eugene's torso, he liked the hefty weight he felt when he tried it on. After that, Eugene pulled out a large spear longer than his height. Is there anything I can help you with?" Nina asked. "Try stepping on this," Eugene said as he gestured at the spear that he had just pulled out and placed on the floor. Following his order, Nina stepped onto the spear. This kept it from rolling around, allowing Eugene to tie sandbags onto the spear. Nina watched on with an overwhelmed look in her eyes. Eugene was currently wearing a large chainmail vest several sizes too big and sandbags hanging from each arm. But on top of that, even more sandbags were being hung onto the spear. There's no way. Just from the looks of it, the spear alone had to be double Eugene's own weight. However, Eugene waved her off with a satisfied expression. "You can move now." "Why, yes." Eugene bent his knees and lifted the spear with both hands. Although he clenched his teeth for a moment at its dizzying weight, the way his muscles tensed and bones trembled filled him with joy. "Get back." "No, even further. Just keep going until you reach the shade," Eugene instructed. "Why, yes." Startled, Nina stepped backward. After checking that Nina wasn't in the way, Eugene swung the spear in a wide arc. Whoosh! The spear was heavier than him, but because he had placed even more weight on himself, he didn't get dragged around by it. This was the secondary purpose of putting on the vest and hanging sandbags onto himself. While taking heavy steps, Eugene kept swinging the spear fiercely. Each time he swung, it felt like his arms were going to be pulled out of their sockets, and his waist, which controlled the rotation, screamed in pain. At this sight, Nina covered her mouth with a gasp. She felt that this exercise might cause a catastrophe beyond the means of recovery for such a young body. However, even as it seemed like Eugene would collapse at any moment, he stayed standing. Whenever his body seemed like it would falter, he instead swung the spear even faster. Then Eugene would force himself to arrest the increased momentum of the swing and immediately transition into a stabbing motion. Pop! He felt the calluses on both hands tear apart. This pain! He couldn't help but feel grateful that he wasn't wearing any gloves, as otherwise, he wouldn't be able to feel this pain. Eugene continued to swing the spear, giggling from pure joy. He compensated for his blood-soaked hands slipping on the spear shaft by holding on with even greater force. His eyes had turned red and bloodshot, and he was breathing rapidly from exerting too much strength. "Hey!" As Nina looked at this scene in awe, she was startled by a voice coming from beside her. "What is that bastard doing?" It was Cyan and Seal. The evil twins had caused countless maids to soak their pillowcases with tears. The two had crept right next to her, and their eyes were twinkling with curiosity. "Why, young master, young lady, what brings you here?" "I asked you what that bastard was doing," Cyan spat out with furrowed brows. He was displeased by the fact that this nameless servant hadn't immediately answered his question. Under the usual circumstances, he would have torn into her so thoroughly that she would never dare make that mistake again. But currently, he was far more curious about what the villager was doing. "Can't you tell just by looking?" This reply didn't come from Nina. Taking a deep breath, Eugene stopped and lowered the spear onto the ground. "Do you know what this is?" Eugene asked as he kicked the spear. What was this bastard thinking? Cyan didn't answer immediately and instead narrowed his eyes, but Seal, standing beside him, grinned and answered. "You idiot, it's a spear, of course. Don't you even know that?" "That's right, it's a spear," Eugene said. "So what?" Seal asked. "Since you know it's a spear, don't you know what swinging a spear is?" said Eugene. "I do know." "Then why were you asking her what I was doing?" "I wasn't the one who asked that. It was my brother who asked." "Then why don't you try and explain to that stupid brother of yours?" "Tell him, that bastard is swinging a spear," Eugene said. Seal's eyes widened into circles at this insult. In contrast, Cyan's eyes became even thinner. "Stupid? Me? Seeing as how you didn't know what was going on when you were looking right at it, you don't seem all that smart. Brother, that bumpkin is calling you an idiot." Seal giggled and poked Cyan in the side. Rather than being enraged like her brother, she instinctively knew that she could make the situation more interesting by arousing her brother's anger in this way. This weak goading from his younger by few seconds sibling was enough to make Cyan cry out, "You dare!" Chapter 5. Cyan wasn't a fool. Of course, he knew that Eugene had been holding a spear and swinging it as a training exercise. However, this was his first time seeing such an unscientific method of training. Wearing a chainmail vest several sizes too big, tying sandbags onto both arms, and swinging a spear that was also laden with sandbags, could you really call that training? At least in Cyan's view, such a training method made no sense. It was far too barbaric and extreme. He was just recklessly swinging and stabbing a spear, without any semblance of style or technique, and he had so little control of his body that he was staggering here and there. How could something like that be called training? This country bumpkin. He's really working his ass off just for a little attention. While the chainmail vest might be large, seeing the state that it was in, it definitely had to have been made from the cheapest scrap iron. This meant that it couldn't be as heavy as it appeared. As for those sandbags, while they might seem hefty, looking at how they bounced as he moved, you could tell that, despite their thick leather casings, they were mostly empty. Even if he's hungry for attention, there should be a limit to his foolishness. Where does he get the nerve, coming here and playing this sort of trick? Actually, he could understand it. This guy was a bumpkin from a place out in the countryside that no one had ever heard of, and even among the collateral lines, Eugene was the lowest of the low. He had probably decided to pull off something like this on the first day after receiving some encouragement from his parents. Without performing a petty trick like this, there was no way he would be worthy of any attention. Though, the fact that his attempt was so transparently fake made it kind of funny. However, unfortunately for him, this bumpkin daring to call Cyan an idiot wasn't at all amusing, and in fact, it was enraging. Calming himself with a deep breath, Cyan pointed a finger at Eugene. Apologize. For what? Asked Eugene. You dare pretend ignorance? Apologize for insulting my intelligence. Sorry about that, Eugene replied immediately. However, Cyan wasn't satisfied with this apology. He narrowed his eyes and raised his chin proudly. Lower your head and apologize more respectfully. Cyan demanded. Aren't we the same age? Eugene asked without moving his head an inch. You're 13. I'm also 13. That means we're pals of the same age, so why ask me to lower my head? There's no way that you and I can be friends. We're not friends? Then why have you been speaking to me so casually ever since you arrived? Eugene concealed the embarrassment he was feeling inside with a click of his tongue. He felt the urge to ask himself, just what do you think you're doing? Adding on the years from his previous life to his current age, he was well over 50 years old. With that much of an age difference, wasn't it just sad that he was getting into a fight with a 13-year-old brat, especially when that brat was one of his old rival's descendants? Well, so what? My past life is my past life. Right now, I'm also 13. When Cyan didn't respond, Eugene pressed him, as I said, what's with the way you've been talking to me? So you aren't just clueless about spears, but etiquette as well? This. Cyan's eyes widened as words failed him. As someone who had been constantly indulged ever since he was young, he grew up spoiled and wasn't familiar with this kind of childish quarrel. This cheeky. The biggest advantage of being a child was that you could act on your emotions without any restraint whenever you wished. So although he wasn't familiar with this type of quarrel, Cyan relied on something that he was accustomed to, venting his emotions onto others. With large strides, he moved forwards until he was standing nose to nose with Eugene. You really don't know your place. Just because your last name is Lionheart, do you really think you're one of the same Lionhearts as us? No. I have a pretty good idea of the difference. I'm from a collateral line, and you're from the direct line. Eugene lifted his finger and pointed towards the main family's mansion. That's your house over there. My house is, which direction was it in again? In any case, it's far away from here. Even knowing all that, you still dare to posture in front of me? Cyan accused. I haven't been posturing at all. I just informed you of a few facts that you seem to have missed. First, you asked what I was doing while looking at me, so I answered. Then you told me to apologize, so I did. You really are impudent, Cyan spat out as he held his nose. Also, there's a stench coming from your body. It's the smell of the cow dung from the countryside mixed in with your sweat. It really, really stinks. I've never gotten close to cow dung in my entire life, so who are you saying smells of cow dung? Eugene asked curiously. If so, that just means it's the smell of your own shit. In any case, you just plain stink. I'll wash up in a bit. No, go wash up now. Once you're done, go and clean the carriage that you rode in as well. The carriage? Because the smell of shit from your body definitely must have rubbed off onto the seat. So I'm telling you to go clean it. And why should I do that? Because you're the one who got your smell all over the carriage. Cyan raised his voice and shouted shrilly. Because of the close distance between the two, Cyan would send spit flying at Eugene with each shout. Eugene frowned and took a step back. Although Eugene had only withdrawn because he didn't want to get spit on, Cyan still looked down on him with a smile of superiority for forcing Eugene to back off. Furthermore, you need to bow your head and apologize to me. I still haven't accepted your apologies for calling me an idiot, saying that I didn't know any etiquette, and for daring to place yourself at my level despite just being a collateral descendant. These all need. Without waiting for Cyan to finish, Eugene turned to Nina and said, Nina. Why yes. You're my personal attendant, right? Yes. Although I am undeserving of this role, I have temporarily been assigned as Master Eugene's personal attendant. If that's the case, then instead of standing there, melting in the sunlight, go and clean the carriage that I rode in on. Yes? Nina had already decided that if Cyan and Seal were to get bored and leave, then she would of course go ahead and clean the carriage herself. So she didn't think that Eugene was giving her an unreasonable order, as it was only a matter of doing the task now rather than later. However, Nina couldn't understand why Eugene would give her such an order under the current circumstances. Didn't he realize that one of the devilish twins was standing right in front of him? Eugene's behavior showed an open disregard to Cyan's orders. What do you think you're doing? Cyan burst out. I'm just getting the carriage cleaned, Eugene explained. I told you to do it yourself. Why should I when there's someone who'll do it for me? I was ordering you to clean the carriage. And who are you to give me orders? I am Cyan Lionheart. Okay, and I'm Eugene Lionheart. Nice to meet you. With a bored look on his face, Eugene waved his hand. Reacting to this, Seal's hands rose to cover a broad grin as she giggled in amusement even as Cyan's jaw dropped open foolishly. And I'm Seal Lionheart, Seal introduced herself, still giggling. After glancing briefly at his cheeky little sister, Cyan took a deep breath. There is no way that I can get along with you. That's quite the disappointment, Eugene commented with a disinterested look. Ignoring Eugene, Cyan continued, because you keep ignoring my orders. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. That's because I'm not in a position that requires me to listen to your orders. And furthermore, you have also insulted me for the last time, Cyan finally finished. Wowzers, was Eugene's latest witty reply. With each word out of Eugene's mouth, a rage was stoked in Cyan's chest. Why was he standing here talking to this bastard? This wasn't why they had come out here and approached this country bumpkin. As the young master of the main family, once he gave an order, the other person was supposed to follow his command without a protest. Cyan's head was about to burst from offended stubbornness and pride. So, brother, are you just going to let that slide? Seal leaned against him and fluttered her eyelashes in anticipation. A duel, Cyan answered her unvoiced question. This wasn't an attempt to live up to his sister's expectations for him, but because Cyan couldn't bear to be looked down on any longer. Having received such disrespect from this country bumpkin, if he didn't do anything in return, he just knew that he was in for several days of teasing at his sister's hands. You have looked down on me and insulted me. As such, we must duel, Cyan declared. What amazing logic, Eugene said as he laughed at how ridiculous Cyan's thought processes were. He had never thought that something like a duel challenge would come from the mouth of this 13-year-old kid. Hey, pal, something like a challenge to a duel isn't something you should do so casually, Eugene advised him. Who's your pal? Cyan retorted angrily. If you don't want to be friends, then fine. In any case, don't say anything that you'll regret and just go. Stop bothering me already. You're scared, right? Cyan said, proudly raising his chin at Eugene as if he had known that Eugene would react like that. Although it was an obvious provocation, Eugene glared at Cyan through squinted eyes as he repeated, scared? That's right. It's obvious that you're scared. If you're too afraid to duel me, then just quickly apologize. And what should I do if I'm not afraid, but I don't want to fight, and I don't want to apologize? Don't you even know what honor is? I do know that it isn't a word that you should utter so lightly. You. You're insulting me again? For some reason, Cyan felt deeply insulted every time Eugene spoke. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Cyan lifted a hand to a pocket on his chest. Don't, Eugene said with a frown. A duel isn't something you recklessly jump into. That son of a bitch. Who does he think he is to keep telling me what to do? Cyan thought as he scowled at Eugene and pulled out his handkerchief. If you're afraid, then just admit it. Don't try to run away from our duel by spouting all these denials. Haven't your parents taught you what honor means? Oh, Eugene said, tilting his head in response to these accusatory words. While Eugene looked at him like he was stupid, Cyan rejoiced at the thought that Eugene had finally fallen for his provocation. So he held out the handkerchief and spread it wide open, inviting Eugene to take a close look. This is really the last time I'll say this. Beg me for forgiveness, and then throw it, Eugene said as he untied the sandbags hanging off his body. You wanted to duel, so just throw it already. Huh? Cyan responded dumbly. I said, throw it. Bang! First, the sandbags on his left arm fell to the ground. Cyan's expression froze and then stiffened as the impact sent a shockwave of dust rising into the air. You. The handkerchief, are you going to throw it or not? Eugene prompted. Bang! Then the sandbags on his right arm also fell. Lastly, Eugene pulled off his chainmail vest and threw it behind him. The vest flew quite a ways before falling to the ground with a heavy racket. Cyan's jaw dropped open at this scene. Yua, Seal had been enjoying the show as if she was just a bystander, but now, she also let out an exclamation at this sight. Eugene bent down and started taking off the sandbags tied to his legs. You must have trained your mana. Cyan, who, until this point, had been frozen with his mouth hanging, yelped in outrage. Children of the collateral lines weren't allowed to train their mana until the bloodline continuation ceremony. This was a long-standing Lionheart family tradition. Only the children of the main house could train their mana and wield real weapons from an early age. This tradition was now being trampled right in front of his eyes. This was no longer something that he could respond to with simple irritation and a tantrum. I haven't trained it though? Eugene replied with a confused expression. He wasn't lying. He could have started training his mana once he reached the crawling stage of infancy, but he hadn't. It was because he didn't want to land his father, Gerhard, in trouble for no reason, and also, since he had been reincarnated as a descendant of Vermouth, he wanted to use Vermouth's own training method. That's obviously a lie. Without training your mana, how could you possibly be able to handle such weight? It's the result of the training I've done since I turned 7. Don't lie to me. It's not like you've tried it out for yourself, so why keep accusing me of lying? If you're still suspicious of me, you can check it during our duel. Eugene sat down and began untying the sandbags from the spear. Cyan was watching this happen with wide eyes when he felt his sister's eager gaze rest on him. He also felt a terrified gaze coming from Nina, who didn't seem to know what to do. The annex's other servants were also showing interest in the commotion from the gymnasium and had gathered around the windows into the room. Cyan was the first to bring up the duel. He was also the one who pulled out a handkerchief, pestered Eugene despite his protests, and finally questioned Eugene's honor. Considering all this, he couldn't back down after coming this far. On top of that, he needed to confirm the sin of a collateral descendant training their mana before the bloodline continuation ceremony. If it was confirmed that Eugene had trained his mana, then he was in for punishment. But if Cyan were to keep his mouth shut and back down at this point, then it was clear that his sister would make fun of him not just for a few days but for eternity. So before doing anything else, Cyan picked up a wooden sword that had fallen nearby. It was the wooden sword that Eugene had been swinging earlier. I challenge you to a duel. Cyan cried out as he threw the handkerchief at Eugene. The fluttering handkerchief fell onto Eugene's shoulder. This happened just as Eugene was untying the last sandbag hanging from the spear. I accept, Eugene said, with a nod, as he rose to his feet. Cyan felt thrilled going into the first duel of his life. The moment he had thrown out his handkerchief, Cyan's heart had begun pounding with excitement. This arrogant fool was a sinner who had ignored family tradition. How should Cyan go about punishing him? In what manner should he teach this fool a lesson so that his younger sister could also admire his magnificence? His thoughts came to a screeching halt right at this point. Just as Eugene got to his feet, he thrust out his spear. Conscious of the fact that he was only holding a wooden sword in his right hand, Cyan had taken a few steps back to get some distance, but he still wasn't able to properly react to the movement of the spear. Bam! The tip of the spear slammed into Cyan's stomach. Quarg! Along with this scream, Cyan was sent rolling across the ground. Chapter 6. It was just a training spear, a wooden staff that didn't even have a spearhead attached. However, its tip had still been sharpened into a point, so once it was thrust correctly, even if it couldn't pierce flesh, it would definitely hurt like a bitch. And if it was thrust cleanly into an unguarded abdomen? This was how it would turn out. While rolling across the ground, Cyan sprayed vomit all over the place. The dumbstruck seal let out a scream and ran over to Cyan, while Nina just covered her mouth in shock. I've won, Eugene said in a bored tone as he lowered his spear. Had it been an actual spear, Cyan would have died from the attack just now. Of course, this wasn't a real spear, but even so, since Cyan had been struck in a vital point and sent rolling across the ground, it was clearly Eugene's victory. Nina, go get someone to drag this bastard away. Why yes. Even as tears and snot were pouring down his face, Cyan couldn't stop retching. Seal had approached him out of concern, but couldn't get any closer to her brother upon seeing his disgusting appearance. So instead, she turned and raised her head to glare at Eugene. Coward. Seal accused Eugene. Who's a coward? From the moment that the handkerchief was thrown, the duel had already started, said Eugene. You're right, but even so, it was still a cowardly act. Does everything seem like a beautiful and peaceful flower garden when seen through that head of yours? Since the duel had already started, there's nothing cowardly about what I did. And didn't your foolish brother end up like this because he just stood around trying to look cool after he threw the handkerchief? Seal was struck speechless by this fierce rebuttal. Part of it was because she didn't know what to say, but she was also confused by what he had said and thought he might have compared her to a beautiful and peaceful flower garden. Did you just call me pretty? Seal asked. Has the heat gotten to her head? Eugene muttered to himself. In any case, it was obviously a cowardly move. You didn't fight honorably in this duel, Seal recalled her indignation.
Ha!
It must be because you're twins, but you really resemble each other in the amazing way you twist logic to benefit yourselves, Eugene scoffed. I don't resemble my brother. Really, but I think your brains are similar? So what do you think an honorable duel should actually be like? Throw the handkerchief, count to 3, and then we fight? Chewing on her bottom lip, Seal glanced at Cyan as she tried to think of a response. Having managed to cover his own body with his vomit while rolling across the ground, Cyan was busy sobbing. While she felt sorry for her brother's miserable appearance, dirty things were still dirty, so she refused to get any closer to him. You could have lightened your blow a bit, Seal mumbled. Sorry, but that's already as light a blow as I can manage, Eugene replied. Have you really not trained your mana? Seal suddenly asked with shining eyes. Eugene, who had started clearing up the sandbags littering the floor, glanced back up at Seal with an annoyed expression on his face. Why aren't you leaving already? I asked you if you really haven't trained your mana. And I already told you that I haven't. Liar. How could you move while carrying such heavy weights if you haven't trained your mana? And then there's your attack. Even if my brother had let his guard down, it was still so fast that he couldn't react properly. As she said all this, her eyes that had been shining with curiosity narrowed in suspicion. Visit for the best no_vel_read_ing experience. At these words, Eugene froze while still in the midst of sorting out the sandbags. You were actually able to see it? Just the littlest bit. Even so, it seems like your eyes aren't just for decoration. You really do have a nasty mouth on you. It's far from my first time hearing that. Everyone, except for Vermouth, had said something similar to him at one point or another. While Eugene was piling up the sandbags in one location, Seal stared absent-mindedly at Eugene's back. Although she couldn't clearly see the movement of his muscles, concealed as they were by his clothes, it did seem like he wasn't using any mana, only physical effort. As such, Seal was finding him even harder to understand. Both Seal and Cyan had also undergone physical training since they were young. But hasn't he only been training since he was 7? Seal thought deeply as she recalled what Eugene had said earlier. Meanwhile, Eugene was thinking, he's quite strong for a 13-year-old kid. He had felt some resistance from the tip of his spear at the moment of impact. This was evidence that Cyan's body had been trained to an unbelievable extent for his age. On top of that, considering the force with which Cyan had flown backward, his mana had already been trained to the extent that it was instinctively able to respond during a crisis by redirecting some of the force away from the blow. And Cyan hadn't just stood there and received the strike. Instead, the moment the attack landed, Cyan had instinctively tried to jump backward. This meant that he, a kid with no practical fighting experience, had instinctively responded to escape imminent danger. That's great for a kid, but as a descendant of Vermouth, it's still garbage, Eugene criticized harshly. Of course, Eugene didn't know how strong Vermouth was when he was 13. Hamel and Vermouth had already been in their 20s when the two had met for the first time. Still, he could at least make a rough guess. Cyan Lionheart, a brat who had received the teachings of the main family all throughout his childhood, was lacking in so many ways that it was hard to believe he really was Vermouth's descendant. Still, there is some potential. This must be because of the standards set by Vermouth's blood. If you looked at what he might become in the future, Cyan had still shown some pretty good potential. And Seal as well. Although they hadn't faced each other personally, she seemed to have pretty keen eyes. You dare. To me. Cyan had finally recovered enough to speak. While taking deep breaths, Cyan raised his head and looked up at Eugene. His eyes were still spinning, and it hurt whenever he moved, as if his abdomen really had been pierced right through. There was also a fishy and rotten taste in his mouth. How cowardly. Cyan gasped. It might be because you're twins, but you two really do end up saying the same things, Eugene snickered as he looked down on Cyan. I don't want to repeat myself. Ask your sister what I said when she tried to accuse me of the same thing. This, son of a bitch. Or else you can try and retrace your memories. You might have been spraying vomit everywhere as you were rolling in the dirt, but your ears should have still been working, right? Cyan couldn't say anything in return. Eugene was right. Even though he'd been in intense pain and was about to lose his mind from the nausea, Cyan had heard Eugene's words. However, even if he had to admit that it hadn't been a cowardly act on Eugene's part, the 13-year-old Cyan absolutely refused to accept his defeat. In front of his sister and all the servants, to have been forced into such an ugly state. Now then, you need to start cleaning all this up. Looking at Cyan's face, which had twisted in humiliation, Eugene continued to provoke him. You're the one who vomited all over the place. So if you promise to clean up this mess, I'll also go and clean the carriage. Then everything is nice and fair, right? You dare. You dare. Also, since you've lost the duel, the honorable and polite thing to do would be to acknowledge your defeat by humbly admitting, I have lost. Even though you were spouting honor this and honor that earlier, you aren't really going to try and do something so disgraceful as to refuse to admit your defeat, are you? Ugh. He couldn't say anything back. He didn't have any way to express his anger, his whole body hurt, and he had a terrible taste in his mouth. Everything seemed to have gone wrong for Cyan. If only the pain was a little less severe, he could get up and demand another fight, but currently Cyan was physically unable to do this. The pent-up anger and sorrow building up within him poured out as tears. As his nose kept sniffling sadly, Cyan buried his head in his arms. Of course, Eugene didn't feel any compassion towards such a sight. After all, wasn't it this brat who had approached him with such a shitty attitude in the first place? However, he was starting to think that screwing with this 13-year-old brat might not have been in his best interests. I should have just held it in. This isn't going to lead to something pointless and shitty, is it? Eugene was finally starting to have a few concerns about the consequences of doing this. Right from the start, he'd been blatantly harassed and disrespected, but now that he had made the child of the main family fall into such a state. In fact, what he was most worried about was that someone might take issue with this incident and set their sights on his father out in the countryside. Just let them try it and see what happens. While Eugene was thinking about this and that, Cyan was desperately trying to hold back his tears. Although he didn't want to look even worse than he already was, he still didn't want to admit defeat. He was in a fit of childish stubbornness. Young master! The shout came from afar, but the speaker quickly closed the distance. The man who arrived at the gymnasium was of strapping height and was dressed in a uniform. From far behind him, Nina could be seen chasing after him, out of breath and holding her skirt up with both hands. What on earth is this? From the fact that he didn't have the lion heart on his breast to how he called Cyan a young master, taken all together, the man had to be a knight in service to the main family. Wow, Eugene thought, his eyes lighting up as he observed the man's movements. While Eugene couldn't tell how old the man was, he seemed much more skilled than Gordon, the knight who had been assigned to escort him here. Hazard, Cyan burst into tears as he called out the man's name. I lost. I challenged that bastard to a duel, but I lost. Cyan explained in between sobs. A duel. Hazard eyed Eugene with a stiff expression. Then he lowered his body and picked up Cyan, covering his hands and uniform in Cyan's vomit. Seal seemed disgusted by this sight and took a few steps back. Pardon me for my late introduction. My name is Hazard, and I am in charge of tutoring young Master Cyan. Shifting Cyan into a more secure position, Hazard bowed his head in a nod. I heard part of the story from the maid, but I was in such a rush to get here that I didn't listen until the end. So, what on earth happened here? I am Eugene Lionheart, from the Jidal province. Eugene introduced himself without bowing his head. Jidal, you say? I believe that is where Lord Gerhard's estate lies. Yes, he's my father. As for this situation, well, Cyan picked a fight with me. I tried not to argue with him, but... Eugene continued speaking while staring directly into Cyan's face. Cyan insulted my father. When did I do that? Cyan protested. Eugene calmly explained. He said that my father had failed to teach me what honor means, and he called me a coward to my face. At these words, Cyan's face went red. He also said that my body smells like cow dung, Eugene added. It's the truth. Your body really does smell like cow dung. And your mouth smells like vomit, so why don't you just shut it? Eugene sharpened his eyes and glared at Cyan. Cyan unconsciously trembled at his fierce gaze. The place where Eugene had hit him for critical damage, his solar plexus, was still throbbing in pain. Visit for the best no_vel_read_ing experience. So that's why you two dueled? Hazard asked. Cyan didn't just insult me, he insulted my father. Sir Hazard, was there any reason why I shouldn't have accepted the duel? Eugene posed a question in return. Sir Hazard felt a strong sense of incongruity at this question. In front of him stood a boy who was just about the same age as Cyan and Seal, but Eugene hadn't allowed his emotions to color his words, as his tone was completely calm. Hazard, who had endured years of the twins' whining, couldn't tell if it was the boy in front of him who was abnormal or if it was the twins who were abnormal. You had a good reason for it, but it seems like you were a bit too heavy-handed, Hazard admonished Eugene. Isn't it an insult to the opponent to show mercy during a duel? Eugene defended himself. Sir Hazard, if my skills were clumsy, then I would be grateful for your advice, but I don't want to hear any advice on how I should use a lighter touch on my enemies. I apologize for my presumptuous remark, Hazard bowed his head once more. Cyan, who was still being carried by Hazard, shouted with his face twisting into a scowl, Hazard. This bastard, he's trained his mana. Even though he's a collateral descendant. He's trained his mana without ever attending the bloodline continuation ceremony. Didn't I tell you to shut your mouth? Eugene said as he glared at Cyan, his head tilted at a dangerous angle. Once again, Cyan fell silent and lowered his gaze. Young master, Hazard gave a long sigh and shook his head. Master Eugene has not trained his mana. Hazard. Even you're lying to me? What reasons could I possibly have for lying to Master Cyan? But that doesn't make sense. How could he beat me without training his mana? And those sandbags. He moved while he had those sandbags hanging from his body. I cannot feel any mana coming from Master Eugene, Hazard said as he glanced at the sandbags piled behind him. Just from a glance, they definitely seemed heavy. So Eugene was able to move with all of that hanging from his body? Hazard was finding it difficult to imagine such a sight. However, no matter how many times Hazard examined him, Eugene did not give off any traces of mana. A lie. It has to be a lie, Cyan mumbled. Master Cyan. For now, we should take a look at your injuries. While coaxing the boy, Hazard glanced over at Eugene. I stabbed him in the solar plexus with a spear, Eugene explained helpfully. And where else? There was only a single blow. A single blow. Hazard let slip a low groan as Cyan bit his lips in embarrassment. If that's the case. Master Eugene, may we meet again? Unable to say anything further, Hazard bowed his head politely. Nina, who had still been trying to catch up to him, arrived at the gymnasium just at that moment. She hesitated, unsure what to do, and eventually just ducked her head. And my apologies, Nina stammered. What do you have to apologize for? Eugene asked as he watched Hazard leave. He had a grin on his face as he watched Cyan, who was still being carried, flop down onto Hazard's shoulders. While it was true that he still felt uncertain about what he had done, it had been fun helping to fix the bad habits of such a spoiled brat. See you later, Seal, who had been skipping along behind Hazard, turned to look back at Eugene with a smile.
Bye.
Eugene returned the smile as he waved.
Goodbye.
To Seal. Chapter 7. So. Ancilla paused as she tried to calm her agitation. However, every time she saw her son, whose eyes had swollen from crying too much, she was in danger of losing control of her emotions. Ancilla patted her chest to stifle the feelings of frustration and picked up a fan to cool her face. My son, Cyan, challenged a collateral descendant to a duel, and lost? Yes, Hazard replied. Hazard made sure not to lift his bent head. He didn't want to increase the number of reprimands he would be receiving from this bad-tempered tigress by pointlessly raising his head. Moreover, did you say that kid hasn't trained his mana? Yes. That doesn't make any sense, Ancilla declared, her reaction unknowingly mirroring Cyan's. She looked at her son in disbelief. Cyan just stood there, sniffling with downcast eyes. Come here. Mother. I told you to come here. Ancilla screeched loudly, unable to hold it in any longer. Cyan's shoulders trembled, along with the rest of his body. Even so, although with hesitant steps, he walked forward until he stood in front of Ancilla. Taking a deep breath, Ancilla sharply thrust out her hand.
Ugh.
Cyan cried out. Her hand was pressing firmly against his solar plexus, even though the pain from earlier had yet to subside. Hazard glanced regretfully at Cyan before lowering his head once more. In a single blow at that? Ancilla hissed. Mother, it hurts. Stay still. Just as he was about to step backward, Cyan's body immediately stiffened at the order. Ancilla used all her strength and repeatedly pressed on his solar plexus without any hesitation. Each time she did so, Cyan was forced to clench his teeth to hold back a scream. Seal was watching this scene with a sullen expression from her seat in the back of the room. She was almost bursting with a desire to say something, but, as young as she was, Seal knew very well that there was nothing to be gained from opening her mouth here. Hazard, are you willing to swear an oath that you saw correctly? Ancilla turned to Hazard. Hazard hesitated. I asked if you were willing to swear an oath, Ancilla repeated herself. That brat, has he truly not trained his mana? Yes, I am willing to swear an oath on it, Hazard finally offered. Under no circumstances should an oath be sworn lightly. However, if he stayed silent now, something terrible would definitely be in store for him. Hazard was sure of it. The son of Lord Gerhard, Master Eugene, has not trained his mana. Not even a single trace of mana can be sensed from his body. Is that so? Ancilla searched her memory for the name Gerhard. His name did not come to mind right away, signifying that she had already classified it as a name not worth remembering. This meant that he definitely had to be the one from the Jidal province. She seemed to recall that Gerhard was the name of a certain insect who didn't even possess an official title and was buried away in the countryside. He was of a collateral line that had split off from the main family hundreds of years ago and, until now, not a single member of that household had ever made any impact. My son, Ancilla said as she pulled up Cyan's shirt. Cyan closed his eyes as his body shivered in fear. Ancilla continued, was defeated in a single blow, by someone who hasn't even trained their mana. The surface of his stomach was vividly colored in blacks and blues. Ancilla let out a snort at the sight of this deep bruising. She was also a scion of a martial family. Her father, Count Canes, held an important position in the Empire's military. Yes, this was definitely done in a single blow. Seal, just how did your brother go about losing? Ancilla asked. Mother. That's, Cyan stammered. I wasn't asking you, Ancilla shot her son a sharp look. Her eyes were so intimidating that it was hard to believe that she was looking at her own 13-year-old son. The moment the duel began, Eugene thrust his spear, Seal said with pursed lips. My brother was startled and tried to fall back, but Eugene's spear was too fast for him to avoid. The distance between the two? Ancilla questioned. It was slightly large. And what was your brother doing at that moment? He was trying to raise his sword. This all happened only an hour ago, not long enough to make things difficult to recall. Each time Seal answered one of Ancilla's questions, Cyan's body trembled with anxiety. Cyan was about to defend himself. However, Ancilla, who had finished processing the whole story, spat out, "You foolish boy." Slap. Cyan's head twisted to the side. Cyan clenched his teeth and held back a groan, having predicted this would happen. Someone who hasn't even trained their mana. A brat who's the same age as yourself. You allowed them to get the first hit. You weren't even able to dodge properly. You let him close the distance on you. And when he struck you, you collapsed, spraying vomit everywhere. Ancilla punctuated each sharp scream with a slap to one of Cyan's cheeks. With each blow, Cyan's head spun from one side to the other. The hits weren't meant to hurt, as none of the slaps had any mana in them. However, it was excessive to inflict such corporal punishment onto a young child. Right in plain view, where anyone, even the lower classes, could plainly see. You dared to lose after asking for the duel first? Do you want to see your mother hang herself out of shame? Sorry. I'm sorry, mother. He could muffle his cries of pain, but he couldn't hold back his sobs. Streams of tears poured down from Cyan's eyes as he sniffled. However, Ancilla felt anger instead of sympathy in the face of her son's tears. Do you think you deserve to cry? Ancilla demanded. Hick, Cyan sobbed. Why did you do such a pointless thing that will only make things harder for your mother? Your father should be returning soon for the bloodline continuation ceremony, but I don't know if I'll be able to even look him in the eye. As for that bitch Tanis, how can I face her after this? For the sake of training, Gilead Lionheart, the patriarch of the main Lionheart line, had been away from the estate for 3 years. Under such circumstances, the authority of the head should normally rest in the hands of Tanis, the official first wife. However, during the family head's current absence, the authority had fallen not to the first wife, but instead to Ancilla. There was a simple reason for this. After giving birth to her child, Uid, Tanis' body had been rendered barren, unable to bear any more children. Gilead, who wanted to make ample preparations for the continuation of his line, couldn't be satisfied with just one son. This was why he had taken a second wife, Ancilla, who had given birth to twins. If there are 3, then it's enough. That was what Gilead said whenever it came up, but Ancilla could never agree with this. The reason why she, the daughter of Count Keynes, had refused many good marriage offers and instead joined the Lionheart family through the shameful path of becoming a concubine, was that Ancilla was obsessed with the prestige of the Lionheart name. They all are going to laugh at me. Definitely, Ancilla muttered as she chewed her fingernails, already imagining Tanis' face when she learned of this. Cyan, who was consumed by terror in the face of his mother's frantic appearance, stuttered and tried to speak. I'll challenge him again. So that mother won't be shamed, I'll. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Again? Ancilla asked, her voice rising sharply. Why are you thinking of challenging him to another duel when you've already been defeated once? Don't do anything useless, and just stay out of trouble until the bloodline continuation ceremony begins. But, Cyan protested. Without letting him finish speaking, Ancilla shouted, Hazard. Hazard's head was still bowed low, and his shoulders trembled as he responded, Yes, my lady. I wish I could just get rid of you for good, Ancilla said as her fists shook in rage. But I can't do that, even though you let something like this happen. Because you are my husband's favored knight. That should mean that there are no problems with what you've been teaching my son, right? Hazard kept his silence. If your teaching isn't the problem, then, my son is. Since he didn't learn well, he was defeated by that peasant brat. If your teaching isn't the problem, then, my son is. Since he didn't learn well, he was defeated by that peasant brat. My apologies. In such a situation, where he could neither affirm nor deny the accusation, and when keeping his mouth shut wasn't an option, offering an apology was the best Hazard could do. Take Cyan and leave, Ancilla ordered. Mother, Cyan trailed off. Ancilla ignored his cry, go and make him stronger, strong enough that he never tarnishes my reputation again. Hazard nodded his head and backed away. Even though Cyan was in tears, the boy followed Ancilla's orders without question, leaving the room along with Hazard. Seal, you stay behind for a bit, Ancilla called out. Caught just as she was about to try and sneak out with the others, Seal's face twisted as she replied, yes. She quietly returned to her seat and waited patiently while taking peeks at Ancilla's expression. Ancilla finally began speaking, that brat, you said that his name was Eugene, right? Yes. Did you also challenge that brat to a duel? No, I didn't challenge him. Why not? Brother lost with a single blow. If we had fought, I wouldn't be able to win either, Seal replied in a quiet mumble. Although she had decided to begin by answering honestly, she was still afraid that her mother might grow even angrier at such an answer. However, Ancilla didn't fly into a rage as she did before and instead said, you did well. Almost like she was a different person, she now stared at her daughter with calm eyes. If even you had shown up here after being defeated, I truly would have hung myself out of shame, Ancilla confessed. Please don't say such a thing, mother, Seal cried out. Of course, Seal actually realized that her mother wasn't the type of person who would take her own life under any circumstances. However, she had learned from a young age that she could improve her mother's mood by acting so cutesy. How is that boy, Eugene? Ancilla asked. I'm not sure I understand what you're asking for, mother, Seal admitted. I'm talking about his appearance and impression. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. His appearance. I think he's better looking than my brother. As for an impression, he's a bit strange. Strange? How so? When he was arguing with brother, he was very childish and mean, but when he was talking with Hazard, he seemed much older. At these words, Ancilla was lost in thought for a few moments. Since the boy was only 13, she could understand him being childish and mean, but for him to seem like an adult when talking with Hazard? Seal continued, he kept saying something about honor. And he also said that showing mercy in a duel was an insult to the opponent. Because Eugene said that, Hazard actually apologized. He apologized? Yep. While saying that he had made a presumptuous remark. As Seal recalled that moment, she started smiling without even realizing it. She soon remembered that this wasn't a situation that called for amusement and immediately reverted her expression, but Ancilla was too distracted to point out Seal's loss of control. A presumptuous remark. Ancilla pondered. It seemed that later she would have to call for Hazard again and get the full story from him. With a slight nod, Ancilla asked, are you angry that Eugene hit your brother? Yes, Seal said eventually. This was a lie. Although she didn't hate her brother, she had found the sight of him crying while still pretending arrogance to be pretty amusing. You mustn't naively try to get revenge on your brother's behalf, Ancilla warned, though she was actually aware of her daughter's true feelings. Since the two of them were twins, Cyan and Seal had been together ever since they were born. Seal had revealed her character from an early age, habitually pulling pranks and making mischief even as she followed her brother everywhere. Ancilla knew that Seal was a child who prioritized her own amusement over her affection for her brother. For the time being, your brother will be busy receiving Hazard's guidance. I'll train with them, Seal volunteered. Of course, you will. However, don't focus too much on that, and make friends with the child. Eugene. Why? It's good to have a lot of friends, Ancilla evaded, her eyes growing cold. The brat had defeated her son and smeared her reputation. However, hearing that Eugene had defeated her son without training his mana had surprised her. For now, that boy, Eugene, is still strong enough to beat your brother. As such, it would be better to get on his good side, Ancilla explained. Is that so? Seal asked in confusion. It is. Ancilla settled her simmering emotions. To be honest, she wanted to go along with her urges and cripple Eugene so that he would be unable to move for the rest of his life. However, she couldn't do that. Hundreds of years ago, there had been an intense struggle over who would inherit Lionheart's direct line. Somehow, peace was negotiated, but ever since then, murdering a relative had been considered a grave taboo among the Lionheart family. The reason that Gilead, the current head of the family, had said, if there are 3, then it's enough, in the first place was that he was afraid of pointlessly increasing the number of heirs to the main family, as it would only lead to siblings trying to kill each other for the sake of ambition. Ancilla herself did not want to risk breaking this taboo that had been passed down for hundreds of years, just for this matter. And if he is harmed, I'm the one who will receive the most suspicion, Ancilla reasoned. Although it was tradition that members of the direct line could openly oppress members of the collateral lines in the days prior to the bloodline continuation ceremony, there was still a line that must be observed. For example, attaching a clumsy servant to be their personal attendant, assigning them an unused annex, and harassing them over trivial matters. No matter how much of a fuss these things kicked up, they still weren't crossing the line. However, if this line was crossed, the guardians of the family commandments would intervene in the situation. Just imagining it caused Ancilla's body to tremble in horror. Ancilla didn't want to get involved with the guardians, especially for such a disgraceful matter. Understood, Mother, Seal said, with a nod and a soft smile, after a few seconds of thought. I'll make sure to get close to Eugene. That's all I need to do, right? She had not the slightest of reservations about doing so. Seal was instead feeling an intense curiosity about this inscrutable relative of hers.